And I will start now, and we'll see how this goes. Who am I to treat this person? That's what came to mind when I saw my first seriously disturbed patient. That's what comes to mind over and over again whenever I treat any seriously disturbed patient. I don't know enough. I don't know enough to treat this person. I don't know what he or she is doing or what it means. On the other hand, from very early in my training, it was very helpful to ask myself, what kind of treatment will this patient get if I don't treat him or her? Now, if Sigmund Freud or Harry Sullivan or Frieda von Reichmann or Sandra Ferenczi were available, of course the patient would get better treatment. But they're not available. All I had to do at that time or since was ask what kind of treatment or therapist, if the patient would even get a therapist, the patient would actually receive if I didn't treat him or her. In most cases, the alternatives were clearly awful. Furthermore, I had hang-ups. I had anal issues from my childhood, problems with anger, and even sexual problems. Potentially violent people make me anxious. The patient needed someone without those problems. But the truth is, there are no therapists without hang-ups. Luckily, patients don't need perfect therapists. They just need therapists who do the best they can do. Of course, our personal therapy or analysis helps greatly. At the very least, it makes it possible to discuss issues that make us uncomfortable. Real therapists, unlike researchers, can't avoid issues that trouble us. We must work with whatever issues the patient needs to have understood. Some therapists who have not had therapy do excellent work. Some therapists, even with many years of personal therapy, never become very helpful. Most of us learn in our own therapy to be more helpful with some problems. But we learn to tolerate and be effective in dealing with issues that are important to the patient that make us uncomfortable, and to do so without undue anxiety. Therapists, as well as patients, deserve to live comfortably. When I work with severely disturbed patients, I often felt scared. But I learned that that was because the patient felt scared. I felt angry, depressed, overwhelmed, and a myriad of unpleasant feelings at times. While they are not always the patient's feelings, they frequently were. And I learned to consider any unpleasant feeling something the patient might be feeling, and to raise that possibility with the patient if I felt it would be helpful. You can't help but be confused. The patients don't understand what's going on. But in addition, they don't communicate even what they do understand. They don't trust us. Why should they? Most of what they have to transfer is awful. They couldn't be that sick unless the people on whom they depended made them feel awful. Moreover, even the mental health people on whom they should have been able to trust and receive help for sometimes were untrustworthy or hurtful and destructive. When patients tell us about abuse from mental health professionals, usually patients are being truthful. They expect us to be equally destructive, or at the very least to approve of what other mental health professionals have done, even if it was harmful. When patients describe being abused, we can let them know that we believe they were abused and that it was unjustifiable. All we have to do is tell the truth. In those few cases where it did not happen, the two of you will discover that as you work. Discussing it as if it was real makes the discovery that it was not real easier. Early in my training, I was taught to consider any memories of abuse and trauma as probably delusional, but that teaching was wrong. Most reports by patients of abuse in childhood or adulthood turn out to be true. When they aren't true, they are usually disguised versions of real abuse or trauma. In general, if you treat a delusion as if it's true, and teach the patient how you would think about and cope with such problems if they happen to you, you will teach them how to think realistically about real problems and how to cope with them. They will learn from you how to think rationally and how to learn as much as possible about coping with real problems. They will then discover with you whether or not and to what extent any of their problems are delusional. They get excited when their lives make sense. You will at times feel hopeless. That's because these patients feel hopeless. Nothing in their life, and probably nothing that previous mental health professionals have said to them, would give them hope. It is up to you to give them rational hope. That you can do by sharing what you know realistically. The patients won't believe you, but they begin to consider it possible that you know what you're talking about. A long time ago, Thomas French talked about the importance of hope for normal functioning. You're the only one who will share a feeling of hope with the patient. We do not have to be unrealistic. The world we live in has many bad things in it, but it is not as horrible as the world seriously disturbed patients believe in. You know that long-term studies show that 30% of schizophrenics have full recovery spontaneously within 25 years, and another third have social recoveries. You know that 80% of depressives get better within 2 years spontaneously. You know that outcomes for a patient who received meaningful psychotherapy is much better than that. In fact, most patients with meaningful psychotherapy do very well, even if they are very disturbed to begin with. Benedetti and Ferlin found that 80% of severe schizophrenics had a very good outcome with 2 to 10 years of treatment 2 to 5 times per week. Median length of treatment was 5 years, and median frequency was 3 times per week. Karon and Vandenbos in our book blindly evaluated schizophrenic patients randomly assigned to psychoanalytic therapy, to medication without therapy, or to combined treatment. An average of 70 sessions of psychoanalytic therapy without medication led to greater improvement in the thought disorder, shorter hospitalization, and much shorter long-term rehospitalization, as well as better ability to hold a job, take care of their children, and lead reasonable lives as compared to patients only on medication. Best results were achieved with psychoanalytic therapy without medication at all, or with initial medication which was withdrawn as the patients could tolerate it. Medication plus therapy was better than medication alone, but not as good in the long run as psychotherapy alone, or psychotherapy plus medication that was withdrawn. But most of you will be familiar with these and other studies with similar results, or with your own clinical observations. Of course, a good supervisor or knowledgeable colleague can help provide the novice therapist with rational hope. But the best basis for rational hope is your own experience with severely disturbed patients who get better. Once one such patient has shown dramatic improvement, the therapist learns that therapy is difficult but doable. One never has to doubt the reality of one's own experience. Most patients are likely to have been told by mental health professionals that they have a genetic, incurable disease. With the best of modern treatments, by which is usually meant medications, they can be made barely acceptable to other people most of the time. There is very little in such false information to give a patient hope. It's important to remember that with schizophrenics, underneath everything else is terror. The patient who is menacing is also scared. The patient who is mute and catatonic is scared that if he or she says something or moves, he or she will be killed. It is helpful to most schizophrenics to say to them that you will not let anyone kill them. Professionals who observed me interviewing a new patient have reported they could see the patient react to that statement even if they didn't seem to be reacting to anything else. I have even been asked by professionals who knew the patient how I knew the patient was afraid of dying because they had forgotten to tell me. But Bruno Bettelheim many years ago described the fact that all acute cases of schizophrenia have a conscious terror of dying. We don't have to understand everything patients say or do. Indeed, that's impossible. If we understand anything, patients are impressed. In their experience, most mental health professionals haven't listened very carefully or understood much of anything. For research purposes, Norman Kagan recorded one session of a schizophrenic patient who I was treating under observation by a graduate seminar of mental health professionals using a one-way screen. I left the room and Kagan played the tape of the session, stopping at every pause and asking the patient what was going on. His thoughts were complex and fascinating. At the end of their discussion, Kagan asked the patient, "Does Karon understand this?" "Of course he does." But of course I did not. I understood the fragments he had told me as best I could, but I didn't understand most of what was going on in his mind. Since then, I have found that this is very general. When patients say they feel understood, it is not necessarily because we correctly understand them. They are responding to our trying to understand them. That's a very good thing. We can't promise to always correctly understand our patients, but we can do our damnedest to try and understand our patients, and that's all they need. There are some advantages to not understanding. You then know that you'll have to act on imperfect knowledge. My first schizophrenic patient, a man in his 30s, had been psychotic for 16 years and treated unsuccessfully at expensive hospitals. In my first session, he sat on his bed, unmoving and making clicking sounds. I didn't know what it meant or what to do. Later in therapy, I would learn that the clicking sound was short for best, which was short for 3/4 infinity best. He had the number 3 come to mind hundreds of times each day, which he would change to 4. We learned that 3 stood for penis, and 4 stood for a world without penises and sexuality, where his mother would love him. He didn't know these meanings consciously, and when we discovered them together and discussed them, his delusions concerning the number 4 disappeared. But that took many months, and there was no way I could guess what was going on until then. I reached out to him as he was sitting in the bed, and he fell off the bed as if he were rigid. I reached out to him again, and he ran to the furthest corner of the room. I followed, and he ran to another corner. I followed. He yelled, "Don't hit me! Don't hit me!" I said, "I won't hit you. I promise I won't hit you." "Not you, him!" He pointed to the center of the room where he apparently saw someone. Horrifying. Not knowing what to do, I used threatening language I had read in a book on Malay magic that witch doctors used in threatening evil spirits and demons. That I would kill him horribly if he didn't leave this boy alone or harm this boy in any way. The patient suddenly relaxed. He was then ready to talk to me for the first time. We had the beginning of a therapeutic alliance. The only problem it caused, which was trivial, was that he complained that I wanted to analyze his hallucinations and delusions when I knew how to get rid of them the easy way. Now, that was the only patient with which I ever used that technique, because that was the only patient for whom it seemed appropriate. It was only possible to do the right thing because I didn't know what to do. Again and again, not knowing has led to improvisations which have led to therapeutic progress. A chronic catatonic patient had a history of emerging violently from his catatonic state. He had broken the jaws of several attendants at previous hospitals. When I worked with him, I was scared of him, found him disgusting, and I didn't like him. Being scared of him was rational. He was dangerous. Being disgusted was also rational. He was urinally and anally incontinent. But in addition to this, I didn't like him. Now that wasn't a rational feeling. On reflection, I became aware that he reminded me of dirty little bastards who picked on me when I was a child. When I grew bigger, they stopped picking on me, but picked on other kids. At this point, it was clear to me that it was unfair to hate him for what other people had done to me, or in my childhood, or in psychoanalytic terms, because of my countertransference. But then I began to think, dirty little bastards. They weren't big guys. Maybe they were scared. The patient wasn't big either, but he was very muscular. The next time the patient seemed to be getting angry, I'd said to him, I know how scared you are. Why don't you use my strength to protect you? The patient quieted down immediately and was responsive to psychotherapy. The attendants at that institution, all of whom had been college football players, thought this was very funny. Your strength, do you know what he could do to you? Of course they were right. I would have been no match for him in a fist fight. But his violence was never a problem after that. The same reassurance from me always worked. Learning to reassure patients against death or violence was a very generally useful lesson. This isn't magic. In general, the dangers they fear aren't realistic, but based on transference. Only a therapist can help. If they are in realistic danger, telling you as much as they know will permit you to help them take whatever realistic actions are indicated. Even paranoids are sometimes in realistic danger. If they act rationally with your help to cope with the dangers, they will discover if the dangers are not realistic and be ready to investigate their meaning. Paranoid delusions should be investigated by encouraging the patient to give us as much detail as possible. Again, we can share the way we would think about these issues if they affected us. We can share with them sources of information and rational ways of investigating issues. You should try not to humiliate the patient. Paranoid patients often combine fears of danger with unrealistic actions that make them the probability much greater that they will be harmed. Thus, a female patient described a strange man of whom she was frightened, walking around her neighborhood at night. When he rang her doorbell and asked to be let in, she opened the door and let him in, even though she was terrified. She said she was afraid that he would get angry at her if she didn't let him in. She was surprised to be told that she should never let anyone in her apartment that she was afraid of, that letting him into her apartment increased her danger. She was further surprised when she was told that if she was afraid of a stranger walking around her neighborhood, she should call the police. She objected that if she didn't let him in, or if she called the police, they might think she was crazy. When, at a later time, she called the police when there was a strange prowler in her neighborhood, she was surprised to find that the police investigated him and found him not dangerous and told her so. They also acted as if calling them to investigate was exactly the proper thing to do. Of course, this is often a transference reaction from a dangerous parent who hurt the child or seemed about to hurt the child, but punished the child or humiliated the child for acting as if the parent was dangerous. A patient had out-of-body experiences. He described them in his first hour. Then he said that he thought I didn't believe him. I did not want to put him down or enrage him, nor did I want to lie to him. Moreover, I am generally too transparent to successfully hide my real feelings. What I did say was that I found it improbable, but I wasn't there and he was. Tell me about it. That was sufficient honesty and acceptance for him to be able to work with me. 6 months later, after we had developed a therapeutic relationship and discussed many issues, he described rising out of his body to the moon, which looked like a large face smiling down at him. And I said, I have an idea. What? It's not your way of understanding. And he said, what is it? It's not your way of understanding. Cut it out, he said. What is it? As you described it, it felt like a child, he interrupted, being lifted in his mother's arms to her face. He got excited and began to translate this experience into a childhood experience and to reconsider his other experiences as repetitions of childhood. He was excited that his experiences now made better sense to him. Always ask patients to describe a delusion in as much detail as they can. Then you can help them discover its meaning. In general, delusions have 4 bases. The most common is transference to the world at large of childhood experiences, and that should be your first consideration. The second basis is the defense against pseudo-homosexual anxieties, as was described by Freud in the case of Schreber. Patients usually need to be told that we all need friends of both sexes, that having a best friend of the same sex is normal, and homosexual thoughts are not usually about homosexuality. Almost always they need to learn that all thoughts are acceptable, that only actions and words can be bad because they have effects on other people, and that thoughts in general cannot be controlled. But it will be a long time for the patient to accept this. The third basis of delusions are strange ways of thinking that are specific to their families, but which the patient believes are general to other people. The fourth basis for delusion is the attempt by the patient to make sense of their life despite having bizarre experiences, including both symptoms and strange real-life experiences. Patients always try to be as realistic as their defenses allow, which is helpful to us when they realize that our way of understanding things makes their life make more sense to them than their previous understanding. Hallucinations could be used like dreams in therapy. Most patients prefer to talk about voices rather than hallucinations, finding the word hallucinations demeaning, and we should follow their wishes. Always ask for associations if the patient is able and willing to provide them. What comes to mind when? Even if the patient will not or cannot associate, it is often easy to guess at the meaning of the hallucination, since the motivation has to be stronger to hallucinate when you are wide awake. All of us can hallucinate when we are asleep. The patient can be told that voices are like dreams, and that therapists use dreams to help in therapy. The main difference between hallucinations and dreams, aside from waking or sleeping, is that most schizophrenic hallucinations are voices, while most dreams are visual. That's because schizophrenia is an interpersonal disorder. One paranoid schizophrenic told me that Bridie Murphy said she would kill you. And I said to him, why do you want to kill me? And he said, you can't blame me for what Bridie Murphy says. Since we had been working together for several months, and he knew to a large extent how I thought, I said, do I blame you for what Bridie Murphy said? He said, no. What do I blame you for? For believing her. I then gave him my schedule, hour by hour, where I would be every hour for that day and the next day. And I told him to tell Bridie Murphy. If Bridie Murphy killed me, we would stop therapy. If she didn't, then we would double his hours. And he said, none of your goddamn bets. We could then explore the meaning of his hallucinations. Hallucinations of God should be treated tactfully. Early in my career, I was assaulted by patients when I told them that their voice was not God. How would you feel if you had a direct line to God and someone tried to take it away from you? Crusades have been fought for less. Of course, if God tells them to do something destructive, like killing themselves or someone else, you must tell them that the voice is not God, because God is not a sadist. When we first try to talk with and understand a severely disturbed patient, what we hear is largely chaos and we don't understand. But psychoanalytic theories are invaluable. With their help, much of what the patient says seems to make sense. It's not that all psychoanalytic theories are accurate. Indeed, it is the fact that psychoanalytic theories are continuously developed on the basis of clinical experience that makes them so powerful. When we read a psychoanalytic theory, we don't necessarily accept it as the truth. But when a patient talks about it, we know that it's true for him or her, although it may have additional meanings which we'll discover. Without psychoanalytic theories, we hear chaos. With psychoanalytic theories, we hear form and order and a first approximation. But there is still chaos, areas that don't make sense, and areas where the implications seem to be contradictory. But this first approximation is invaluable. It gives us a place to begin. And we begin to listen around the areas that don't make sense or the implications are contradictory. Castration anxiety seemed an abstract concept to me until the patient yelled, "Don't cut them off, Dad," while he covered his genitals with his hands. For him, castration anxiety was obviously a reality. However, another patient, when I interpreted that he might have been afraid his father would castrate him, said, "He wouldn't castrate me, he'd kill me." Of course, we both accepted his version of reality. The patient's statements should always be taken seriously, but even when they're consistent with theory, they are often only the beginning. Thus, fears of castration by the father may be in part a defense against an even more frightening fear of castration by mother, who may have made such threats in connection with childhood masturbation, or against the terror of the inside of the body being drained through the penis, which I've described in a previous paper. When in doubt about the psychodynamic meaning of material, with severely disturbed patients, it is generally good procedure to emphasize problems from the oral phase and problems concerning survival. One can overemphasize the importance of theory, especially of a particular theory. Therapists of different theoretical orientations, psychoanalytic, psychological, or psychiatric, who've worked with severely disturbed patients understand each other. It is notable at the meetings of this organization that therapists using different theories who have worked with seriously disturbed patients readily understand each other. The words used and some of the relevant abstractions are different, but each of them understands what the problems are with which the other therapist is trying to cope. Some of the techniques may be different, but they understand each other and what the other therapist is trying to do. This is different from the reactions of professionals who've only read about these patients or possibly did some research or processed patients superficially but have no real feel for what it is like to try to be helpful to people in such dire psychological states. As is usual in any therapy, the transference is an essential part of the therapeutic process. It is an invaluable source of information about the patient's past and the sources of his or her problems. At the same time, it represents the most important of the resistances, the difficulties in the treatment process. As mentioned above, since their lives have been worse than those who are neurotic, the transference tends to be more negative. The blank screen will inevitably turn into a monster. We should try to be unambiguously helpful, although it's difficult for the patient to perceive it. We're accustomed to asking ourselves continually, am I the patient's mother or father? But we also may be any important figure in the patient's past. We may be a sibling, grandparent, or any important figure. We may even be a destructive mental health professional in the patient's past. Nonetheless, it's true that for most patients, the most important figures are mother and father, and both are transferred to the therapist, whether the therapist is a man or a woman. Particularly when the patient treats us badly and we're confused, it is often because the patient isn't treating us as if we were his or her mother or father, but treats us the way the destructive parent treated the patient. These are frequently sessions that are hard for us to take, but we are not crushed by the patient's, but if we are not crushed by the patient's reaction, we are already being helpful. They learn that it is possible to endure mistreatment. If we react in a reasonable, self-protective way without hurting them, they learn that it is possible to protect oneself without doing harm to oneself or others. If, in addition, we can relate what happened in the session to what must have happened to them, the therapy moves forward even more. Therapeutic change in psychoanalytic therapy seems to be primarily the result of two things: understanding and the internalization of the therapist. The patient learns to understand themselves, their agonies and maladaptive reactions from the material of the therapy and the therapist's interpretations. It's helpful to present interpretations as, I wonder if, so that the interpretation does not become a contest of wills. Since even neurotic patients hear every interpretation as an accusation, it is useful to phrase interpretations as anyone would feel, or it would only be human to feel. The patient doesn't need anyone else in his or her life to add to their humiliation. The internalization of the therapist is crucial. It goes on without explicit discussion in most therapies. Nonetheless, the patient internalizes the therapist as a new superego, kinder and more rational than the superego's figures of the patient's life before therapy. The patient internalizes the therapist into the ego as a model of how a human being might be. This concerns us as therapists, since we don't want the patient to adapt our weaknesses or hangups, but we provide a better model of a human being than most of the people the patient has used as models. Moreover, the patient, as a result of growing in therapy, is very much like the adolescent. They will internalize the therapist, but continue to grow and reject the parts of the therapist which aren't helpful. Feelings are at the center of any meaningful therapy. In fact, they are the center of any meaningful experience. It is one of the great mistakes of psychology that for a long time we treated feelings as if they were irrational. But emotions are a central part of rational thinking. As Tompkins most clearly pointed out, feelings are summary statements of what's going on. Freud said that emotions are what psychoanalysis is all about. Well, what else could it possibly be about? Carl Rogers and his colleagues demonstrated the centrality of feelings and of paying careful attention to feelings for successful therapy and for successful living in general. If we are scared, there is something to be scared of. If we're sad, there is something to feel sad about. If we are angry, something is hurting us. If it is not something of which we are aware, it is unconscious. If it isn't in the present, it's in the past, and something in the present is symbolic of it. If we feel good, there is something to feel good about. Patients believe that their feelings are irrational. With our help, they learn that their feelings make good sense and that they are bearable. Even the negative affect of shame is useful to understand. As Tompkins pointed out, one can't feel ashamed unless one wants a relationship with someone and feels that it is not possible. But you can help the patient understand that wanting a relationship is healthy. And even if it isn't possible in some instances immediately, it will be possible eventually. In fact, a relationship with their therapist is possible immediately. While a patient may denigrate this relationship, it is always very important to them. Depressed people tend to be unique in two ways. The first is that they are genius at making you depressed. Obviously, they are depressed about themselves and their lives. Any possibility, they can assure you, will not work and will not help them. Moreover, anything you say or have said has not and will not help them. They are often good at bad-mouthing you in general. They are very convincing. It is not surprising that you will find yourself angry at them. Mental health professionals in general feel angry at depressed patients, but feel they shouldn't be angry. Consequently, it's not surprising that mental health professionals sometimes feel relieved when bad things happen to a depressed patient, as long as it can't be interpreted as a bad thing that they've done to the patient. At one psychiatric hospital, it was observed that the psychiatric residents, the nurses, and the attendants laughed whenever a depressed patient with whom they had worked was assigned to ECT. They did not laugh when any other patient was assigned to ECT or when the depressed patient was assigned to therapy or medication. When you're angry at them, it's useful to remember that this is evidence that their depression is at least in part based on anger. Of course, depressed patients are not usually aware of their anger and the part it plays in their depression, but everyone who deals with them feels it and tends to dislike them for it. This only makes the depression worse. However, no matter how good they are at proving that they're worthless and that you and the therapy are worthless, they unconsciously hope that they will not succeed in convincing us. Moreover, they often will not even tell us about an improvement because they are afraid we will punish them or take it away from them. After all, when they tried to convince you that you and your work are worthless, they were only acting out in the transference what had been done to them. The second way in which depressed patients are different is their use of isolation as a defense mechanism. They don't connect things which seem obviously connected. It is not unusual when you ask a depressed patient what happened before their depression started to be told, nothing. Something must have happened, you were alive. Nothing important. If you persist, they'll eventually tell you things that would depress anyone, but which they did not connect with their depression. In my experience, every so-called endogenous depression has very good reasons for being depressed. As Viggo Jensen once said, an endogenous depression is a very severe depression in someone whom you haven't talked to long enough to find out why they're depressed. It would be very easy to exaggerate the difference between severely depressed patients and schizophrenic patients. Every depressed patient has to cope with massive terror, and every schizophrenic has severe depressions. As Michael Teixeira has pointed out, the basic therapeutic approach is the same with both sets of patients, as well as with patients who have both sets of symptoms. The most useful paper on the treatment of manic depressives, severe bipolar disorder, is the one by Michael Teixeira. Of course, just because a patient is diagnosed as depressive does not mean that he or she necessarily feels depressed. They may feel sad, guilty, scared, angry, or have no feelings at all. You don't know what they feel unless you ask them and they tell you. The most severely depressed patients do not feel sad, they feel nothing at all. When they begin to feel sad or cry, they're usually getting better. The dead feelings are a defense against unbearable affect. Patients who are suicidal obviously make us uncomfortable. We don't want them to die. But every seriously disturbed patient considers suicide at some point in their treatment. In my experience, meaningful psychotherapy is the most effective way to keep them alive. Patients who threaten to kill themselves should be taken seriously. They should be asked to talk about it. Patients who describe killing themselves in fanciful and elaborate ways that don't seem practical are not likely to be dangerous. But patients who describe themselves committing suicide in practical ways with available weapons are much more dangerous. The most dangerous thing a therapist can do is nothing. Jensen and Petty suggested that suicidal patients project their superego onto someone else whom they implicitly ask, "Do I deserve to live or die?" That is why suicidal patients almost always tell someone. If that someone does nothing, the patient concludes they deserve to die. If that someone is a therapist, the therapist certainly must do something that indicates the therapist does not think the patient deserves to die. A psychology intern early in her career was supervised by a well-published psychologist. A patient brought a gun to the therapy hour and said that he was going to kill himself with it. Not knowing what to do, the intern reacted rationally. "No, you're not." She took his gun and put it in a drawer and closed the drawer. Her supervisor told her that she could not do that. It was interfering with the patient's autonomy. Further, the gun was the patient's property, and she had no right to take it away from him. Despite her qualms, she followed her supervisor's advice and returned the gun. The patient shot himself after he left her office. Obviously, he interpreted the return of the gun as a message of what he should do. If the supervisor had been knowledgeable enough to have read Jensen and Petty, he would have done the right thing. The intern, without knowing what to do, used her own judgment and did the right thing. But the supervisor, with some sophistication and the wrong set of abstract principles, and the patient died. If you do not know what to do as a therapist, act like a human being. It will almost always lead you to do the right thing. One of the things the therapist can do is to interpret the meaning of the wish to commit suicide. The most common wish is to hurt someone else. This wish may be conscious or unconscious, but the therapist can make it conscious by saying, "Some people kill themselves to get even with someone else. I wonder if you want to get even with, or I wonder if there's someone you want to get even with." I recommend adding, "But it is stupid." If that someone does not like the patient, they'll be happy when the patient dies. If that someone, like a parent, might feel unhappy, they will feel unhappy a little, not the agony the patient hopes for, and not the agony the patient will inflict on themselves. One ambulatory schizophrenic who was suicidal after his wife left him said, after a session in which such interpretations were made, "I'm not going to let her piss on my grave." He didn't kill himself but continued therapy. Another patient who began a telephone call by declaring her intention to kill herself continued for a full session on the phone, which ended with, "Damn you, Karon, I always felt that if worst came to worst I could kill myself, but now you've taken that away from me." She was furious at me, but she didn't kill herself, and she continued her treatment. Hopelessness is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for suicide, but the therapist can arouse realistic hope. After all, most of the reasons people commit suicide are solvable. It's possible to find a new love, a new job, or to live on a lower income. Only in infancy do we have one love, our mother, who can never be replaced. One thing we can and must do is to give the patient the relationship with us as one relationship on which they can depend. It is well known that some depressed patients commit suicide when they seem to be getting better. This is usually explained on the basis that the patient didn't have enough energy to commit suicide. But as they get better, they have enough energy to kill themselves. This is not what is going on. As Atwood learned by listening to patients, some depressed patients decide to solve their problems by killing themselves. Since they think they have a solution, they seem to be getting better. Then they carry out their solution and kill themselves. If depressed patients are genuinely getting better, they have more insight into why they are depressed. They also talk more about the future. If the therapist raises the issue of suicide, they will discuss it. If depressed patients seem to be getting better because they've decided to kill themselves, they do not have any more insight into why they are depressed. They do not talk about the future because they don't have any. If the therapist raises the issue of suicide, they will either not discuss it or unemotionally tell you they intend to kill themselves. If all three of these indices are in the right direction, the depressed patient is getting better. If all three of these indices are in the wrong direction, the depressed patient intends to kill him or herself, and the therapist needs to do something about it. In addition to therapy, there are realistic measures which sometimes are helpful. A locked ward can be temporarily helpful, but I have known patients who found ways of killing themselves in a locked ward or by escaping the locked ward. None of these patients were in intensive psychotherapy. I have known patients in solitary confinement in a reformatory who managed to hide a piece of metal or glass cylinder which they intended to kill themselves. They had begun psychotherapy and didn't kill themselves, although they did make cuts on their body before they stopped. Having someone stay with a patient or keep an eye on a patient who is suicidal is very helpful. This is kinder and more helpful in most cases than a locked ward if there are relatives and friends willing to take on the burden. The thematic apperception can be useful with suicidal patients. The more cards you use, the easier it is to make an accurate prediction. Card 3BM, card 12M, or 12F of both the therapist and the patient are female. Card 14 and card 16 should always be included for both men and women. Usually 6 to 12 cards are used. It is usually possible to estimate not only the danger, but the conditions under which the patient will or won't commit suicide. Unfortunately, some few patients manage to commit suicide under any circumstances. It's often clear that the patient intended to set the therapist up to feel like a failure. Some therapists have been badly damaged by such patients. It's always useful to consult with a colleague and or a therapist to discuss what happened if a patient does kill him or herself. One is tempted to use antidepressant medication with a patient who is suicidal, but recent data suggests that antidepressants do not effectively prevent suicide. Apparently 30% of normal volunteers became acutely suicidal with antidepressant medication, which disappears when the drug wears off. Most people, depressed or not, will not kill themselves, and an even smaller group will kill other people. But antidepressant medication seems to increase the rate of suicide and of homicide. If patients are taking antidepressant medication, it is useful to warn them that if they feel like killing themselves or someone else, it is not them, it is their medication. They should get immediate help in changing or reducing the medication appropriately and hopefully get psychotherapy. Homicide. Homicidal threats are even more scary to therapists than suicidal threats. Again, the patient should be taken seriously. Get the patient to describe their intentions in as much detail as possible. Again, fantastic or unrealistic murder techniques are not likely to be dangerous, but realistic ones might well be. Each state has legal standards of procedure that have to be obeyed. Their purpose, like ours, is to try to make sure that the murder doesn't take place. But it has been my experience that the best preventative is competent psychotherapy. Thus, one multiple murderer was in a reformatory on a minor charge. His psychiatrist tried to turn him in, only to discover that the only way the patient could be convicted was if he confessed. In many ways, he was psychotic, but he had no intention of confessing. His therapist, with whom he would no longer work, recommended maximum sentence. This would have only kept him in jail for 2 years, after which he would return to society as a better trained criminal. He was thoroughly unlikable, but treating him was the only way to protect society. 6 months of psychoanalytic therapy ended his symptomatic murders. He now felt guilty about his murders, and about his beating of innocent victims. On my recommendation, he was paroled with mandatory therapy as a condition of parole. He did not commit any more murders. He did return to jail for breaking and entering. We did not have enough time to deal with his irrational way of earning a living, unfortunately, but both he and I felt that his not murdering was well worth the time and work. In my experience, murderers are always people who cannot stand conscious anger. They can kill, but they cannot tolerate feeling angry. They either act on their anger immediately or, more commonly, do not feel the anger at all. Thus, it's helpful to teach the patient to feel angry, but not to kill. Get them to tell you who they want to kill and why. Encourage them to feel angry and even validate that this person deserves to die if that judgment seems irrational. But then add that it would be stupid to kill them because it would ruin the patient's life. The patient needs to know that it is all right to want to kill anyone, but it is not all right to kill anyone except under unusual circumstances like realistic self-defense. They need to know that it is all right to think anything, to feel anything, that only actions are subject to moral judgment, and that you will discuss anything they need to think about, no matter how bad they think it is. The Michigan State Psychotherapy Research Project found that schizophrenic patients responded to psychoanalytic therapy best if they were not on medication. Initial medication, which was withdrawn as rapidly as the patients could tolerate, was nearly as effective. Maintenance medication combined with psychotherapy was better than medication alone, but not as effective in the long run as psychotherapy alone, or psychotherapy with initial medication that was withdrawn. The most dramatic difference was the improvement in the thought disorder with psychotherapy. The ability to think logically when you want to. This seemed to have increasing impact on their way of life and consequent ability to stay out of the hospital as time went by. Consequently, our recommendation is that patients should be treated by psychotherapy alone if the patient, the therapist, and the setting, that is the hospital, family, or other living arrangement, can tolerate it. If any one of these three can't tolerate it, the patient should be started on medication with psychoanalytic therapy to produce initial behavioral control. But the patient should be withdrawn from medication as rapidly as they can tolerate it. While in our project we studied only severe schizophrenics, the same recommendation would be made for other serious mental patients. Continuing medication indefinitely slows the improvement in the thought disorder. Moreover, we are now learning that there are serious medical risks in maintaining psychiatric medication indefinitely, as well as poor long-term outcomes. However, if the patient has been on medication for a long time, It seems clear that one must withdraw the patient slowly. Bregan and Cohen, and Bregan's books, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, are brief, convenient, and accurate sources of information about the known side effects of psychiatric medication, the known withdrawal effects of current medication, and recommended procedures for safely withdrawing patients from currently used psychiatric medications. Of course, the optimal use of medication is a legitimate source of disagreement among helpful professionals. There are those who always medicate their patients, those who never medicate their patients, and those who temporarily medicate their patients or use medication to cope with crises. Serious mental health professionals disagree, and each of us must take our own clinical experience seriously. Nonetheless, this is my recommendation. In many settings, particularly those in which younger professionals work, the therapist may have little choice about whether and to what extent medication is used. In that case, one can only do the best work possible under the circumstances. As one gets better known, even among one's immediate colleagues, it is typical to find one's clinical judgments increasingly respected. For detailed summaries of the currently known downsides to current psychiatric medications, see Bregan and Jackson, Grace Jackson's book and Peter Bregan's books. Unfortunately, I think we skipped something. Oh, I see. Okay, ECT. Unfortunately, patients who have received ECT improve very slowly during analytic therapy as compared to patients of equal severity who have never received ECT. Other therapists have estimated it takes 3 to 6 times as much work to produce similar progress. I was startled to discover how rapidly some psychotic patients improve when I first worked with patients who had never received ECT. The books by Hilda Andre, by Morgan, and by Peter Bregan detail the evidence that electroconvulsive therapy probably leaves permanent brain damage, which undoubtedly is related to the difficulty in making use of psychotherapy by patients who have received ECT. In any event, I would strongly recommend that psychoanalytic therapy or other sensible therapy be tried before rather than after ECT. Of course, it is the experience of most therapists that ECT will not be necessary if meaningful therapy is available. It is my recommendation that one should not treat only seriously mentally ill patients. There is no single group of patients that I believe we treat best if we treat only that one kind of patient. Both the patients and the therapists do better if we treat a varied group of patients so that the defenses and the issues vary. Of course, despite the differences in process and in resistances, the basic issues remain the same for all patients, which is how best to be a human being. Working with severely disturbed patients is difficult, it is tiring, it is demanding, it is scary, and sometimes depressing. But most patients respond, and when severely disturbed patients respond to psychotherapy, the change is not subtle. When patients who will not eat begin to eat, when patients who hear voices no longer believe they are real and eventually do not hear them as external, but have them merge with their other thoughts, when patients who were not logical become logical, when patients who are too sick to work are able to work, when patients who cannot adequately take care of their children take care of their children, it would be hard to miss that something important has happened. It is a benign trauma for the therapist from which we never recover. Thank you.